Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that 1 in every 4 people you know has simply vanished. Poof, gone. They aren't hiding, they aren't on an extended vacation, they've just been erased from the map. For the people of Bulgaria, this isn't the plot of the next Avengers movie, it's their mathematical reality. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Bulgaria's population has plummeted from nearly 9 million to around 6.4 million today. That is a demographic freefall of over 25%. Welcome to the fastest shrinking country on planet Earth. Today, we're dissecting the anatomy of a dying nation. From ghost villages that look frozen in the 19th century to the economic quicksand of brain drain, political corruption and oligarchs, we are going to look under the hood. We'll explain exactly how a modern European state hollows out, and what the data tells us about its ultimate fate. Let's get into it. 1. The demographic death spiral. Let's start with the hard numbers. In the 1980s, Bulgaria was a heavily industrialised powerhouse of the Eastern Bloc. It had almost 9 million people, a robust, if completely artificial manufacturing base, and a relatively young workforce. Fast forward to today, the year is 2026, and the official population sits precariously around 6.4 million. According to United Nations projections, by 2050, that number is highly likely to hit 5.4 million. To put that into perspective, Bulgaria has lost more of its population in peacetime than many nations lose during an all-out war. It's like the entire population of Chicago just picked up and left or died without a single shot being fired. Now, let's apply the strongest counter-argument here. If you're economically savvy, you might be thinking, look, the entire developed world is dealing with a fertility collapse. South Korea has a birth rate of 0.7. Japan is selling more adult diapers than baby diapers. Italy is basically an open-air retirement home. Bulgaria isn't special, it's just following the standard European trajectory. It's a fair point. But here is where the data comes in and dismantles that argument entirely. If you look at the mechanics of population decline, it's driven by 2 things: natural growth, births minus deaths, and mechanical growth, immigration minus emigration. Let's look at the births first. Surprisingly, Bulgaria's total fertility rate, TFR, has hovered around 1.7 to 1.8 children per woman over the last few years. Now, 2.1 is the strict mathematical replacement level, so 1.8 isn't phenomenal, but it's actually higher than the European Union average. It's higher than Spain, Italy, and massively higher than East Asia. So, a lack of babies is a problem, but it isn't the primary killer. The real grim reaper here is the mortality rate. Bulgaria routinely posts the highest mortality rate in the entire European Union, hovering around 15 deaths per 1,000 people. Why? Because the country is suffering from a chronic systemic health failure. Cardiovascular diseases, incredibly high smoking rates, and a healthcare infrastructure that we will dissect in a later chapter all combine to create a perfect storm. It's like playing SimCity, but you accidentally set the healthcare budget to 0 and a meteor hit your hospital. Imagine you're a 25-year-old living in a medium-sized provincial town like Lovech or Gabrovo. You look around. Your grandparents are dying of entirely preventable heart conditions because the nearest fully equipped modern hospital is 3 hours away in Sofia, and your local clinics are starved of funding and doctors. But here is where the mechanics of the death spiral truly kick in. The death rate is high, yes, but the engine turbocharging Bulgaria's demographic collapse is emigration. Since the borders opened in the 1990s, and especially after Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007, the youth didn't just walk out the door, they sprinted. Over 2 million people have emigrated, and here is the crucial mechanic that people misunderstand about mass emigration. It doesn't just subtract one person from the population count, it subtracts an entire future lineage. When a 22-year-old Bulgarian software engineer moves to Germany, Bulgaria doesn't just lose a worker, it loses the tax revenue that worker would have generated for the next 40 years. It loses the consumer spending that would have supported local businesses, but most importantly, it loses the 1.8 children that engineer is statistically likely to have. Those kids are now born in Munich, not Sofia. This fundamentally breaks the economic math of a nation. It creates what economists call a constrictive population pyramid. Instead of a wide base of young workers supporting a small peak of elderly retirees, you get an inverted shape. The median age in Bulgaria is now around 46 years old. That makes it one of the oldest populations on the planet. This leads us to the terrifying mechanic of the demographic Ponzi scheme. Think about how a national pension system works. It is, by definition, a legal, state-run Ponzi scheme. The current workers pay taxes today, and that money is immediately handed to the retirees today. The social contract dictates that the young labour to support the old, with the promise that one day they will be supported in turn. It works brilliantly, as long as the base of the pyramid keeps growing. But what happens when you have 1.5 million people over the age of 65, almost 24% of the country, and a rapidly shrinking base of 20-somethings paying into the system? The math stops mathing. To keep the elderly from starving, the government has to do one of three things. 1. Cut pensions. This is political suicide, as the elderly are the largest voting bloc. 2. Print or borrow money, which causes inflation or debt crises. 3. Raise taxes on the remaining young workers, inevitably governments. Lean heavily on option 3. So, you're our 25-year-old in Lovitch again. Not only are your local services crumbling, but a massive chunk of your paycheck is being siphoned off to support an ageing population that vastly outnumbers you. You realise that you're holding the bag in a financial game of musical chairs, and all the chairs have already been taken by the older generations. You are carrying an unsustainable economic burden. So, what do? You do what anyone acting in their own rational economic self-interest would do. You pack your bags, buy a one-way ticket to London, and you leave. This is the death spiral. High mortality and low births create an ageing population. The ageing population increases the tax burden on the youth. The high tax burden and lack of opportunity force the youth to emigrate. The emigration of the youth removes the tax base and future births, which mathematically accelerates the ageing of the population. Rinse and repeat until the lights go out. And the spatial reality of this is shocking. It's not just that the numbers are going down, it's where they're going down. Bulgaria isn't shrinking evenly. Capital cities like Sofia act like black holes, sucking up the remaining youth and resources, creating a localized illusion of prosperity, while leaving the rest of the country to literally turn to dust. Currently, an estimated 40% of Bulgaria's territory is classified by researchers as a demographic desert. It is a slow-motion collapse dictated by the unforgiving laws of arithmetic. You can't argue with demographic momentum. Once a cohort of potential mothers leaves the country, or ages out of their reproductive years, you cannot retroactively create them. Current trends suggest that unless a monumental, unprecedented economic shift occurs, this trajectory is locked in for the next few decades. And the craziest part? The population collapse is just the symptom. The disease is what we're going to cover next, because you don't lose a quarter of your population just because people like the weather in Spain better. You lose them because the domestic economy is fundamentally rigged. 2. The oligarch economy, how to capture a state. There is a famous dark joke in Eastern Europe that perfectly encapsulates the reality of this region. Every country has a mafia, but in Bulgaria, the mafia has a country. To understand why a quarter of the population has fled, you have to understand that they aren't just running from low wages. They are running from a fundamentally rigged economic game. We need to talk about state capture. Now, when most people hear the word corruption, they picture a traffic cop taking a $20 bill to ignore a speeding ticket, or a low-level bureaucrat demanding a bribe to stamp a permit. That is petty corruption. It's annoying, it's a drag on the economy, but it doesn't hollow out a nation. State capture is entirely different. State capture is an economic mechanic where a small group of oligarchs doesn't just bribe the government to break the law, they become the government so they can rewrite the laws to make their monopolies. Perfectly legal. It is a transition from an economy of free enterprise to an economy of modern feudalism. Imagine you are a 30-year-old entrepreneur in the coastal city of Varna. You start a medium-sized logistics company. You are smart, you work 80-hour weeks, and you start outcompeting the established politically connected firms. In a normal market economy, you would grow, hire more people, and get rich. In a captured state, your success triggers an immune response from the oligarchy. Suddenly the fire inspectors show up and find a critical violation. Then the tax authorities freeze your accounts pending a routine multi-year audit. Then you get a polite phone call offering to buy your company for pennies on the dollar. If you say no, your operating licenses are legally revoked. It isn't a shakedown, it is a perfectly legal administrative strangulation. This brings us to the ultimate prize in the Bulgarian economy: European Union structural funds. When Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007, Brussels opened the financial floodgates. Billions of euros were poured into the country to modernise its infrastructure, agriculture and energy grids. It was supposed to be a golden ticket to the first world. Instead, it became the largest, most reliable ATM for the ruling class. Let me explain the exact mechanics of how you steal a European highway. You don't just steal the cash out of the treasury. That's amateur hour. That's how a street thug operates. Instead, the government announces a massive public procurement tender for a new multi-million euro road. But the tender requirements are written with hyper-specific, utterly arbitrary conditions. For example, requiring a certain fleet of asphalt machinery that only one specific domestic company happens to own. Magically, only the oligarch's construction firm legally qualifies to bid. Because they have no competition, they win the contract at a massively inflated price. They then build the road using substandard, paper-thin materials. They pocket the massive profit margin legally. And the dark punchline: when that cheap road inevitably crumbles full of potholes 2 years later, the government issues another EU-funded contract to the exact same company to repair it. It is a perpetual motion machine of taxpayer graft. Quick pause. If you're finding this breakdown of economic mechanics fascinating, hit that subscribe button. It helps us deep dive into the realities the mainstream media glosses over. Also, let me know in the comments which country's economy you want me to dissect next. You might be thinking, wait a minute, Bulgaria is in the European Union. The EU isn't stupid. They have strict auditing. Brussels has OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office. They don't just hand over billions of euros without checking the receipts and punishing the fraudsters. It is a completely logical assumption. But here is the brilliant, insidious mechanic of Bulgarian state capture. The oligarchs didn't just capture the businesses, they captured the referees. When European anti-fraud watchdogs suspect embezzlement, they cannot directly throw a Bulgarian citizen into a Bulgarian prison. Jurisdictionally, they have to hand their findings over to the local authorities, specifically the Bulgarian Prosecutor's Office. For decades, the system was designed so that the Prosecutor General was essentially an untouchable figure, answerable to almost no one. If the Prosecutor's Office decides there is insufficient evidence to pursue the oligarch, the case dies on a desk. The EU's hands are tied. It's the equivalent of calling the cops because someone is robbing your house, and the burglar answers the 911 call, tells you to calm down, and legally repossesses your television. To truly understand the sheer audacity of this system, we have to look at the final boss of the Bulgarian political landscape, a man named Delian Pivski. Pivski is a media mogul, a businessman, and a politician. But more importantly, he is the walking embodiment of the country's institutional paralysis. In 2021, the United States Treasury Department dropped the hammer on Pivski, sanctioning him under the Global Magnitsky Act, a brutal legal tool designed to freeze the assets of the world's worst human rights abusers and most corrupt actors. The US government explicitly stated that he regularly engaged in corruption, using influence peddling and bribes to protect himself from public scrutiny and exert control over key institutions. The United Kingdom immediately followed suit, with their own sanctions. Normally, being financially excommunicated by the world's financial superpower is a career ender. You become politically radioactive. But in Bulgaria, Pivski didn't just survive, he doubled down. Fast forward to today, the year 2026, and he remains one of the most powerful political figures in the entire country. His political faction acts as an absolute kingmaker in the National Assembly. Imagine if Al Capone was federally sanctioned, and the very next day, he walked into the state legislature to decide who gets to be the governor. That is the level of institutional capture we are looking at. Democratic institutions exist, but they are empty shells, stripped of their function to serve the public interest and entirely subordinated to private wealth. And this circles us right back to the demographic death spiral. You cannot outwork a rigged system. When a smart, educated, 25-year-old Bulgarian looks at this reality, they do the math. They realise that their taxes will go to oligarch-owned cartels, their business will be capped by local monopolies, and the justice system will protect the predators. They don't see a developing competitive market economy. They see a feudal system with better Wi-Fi. So they leave. And when the brightest minds and hardest workers leave, what happens to the economy they leave behind? it doesn't just stagnate, it morphs into something far more dangerous, an economy completely dependent on the very thing destroying it. Let's look at the financial quicksand next. 3. The shadow economy and the remittance trap. Imagine you are an auditor from the European Central Bank, sent to Sofia to figure out why a country with a shrinking workforce, collapsing demographics, and chronic corruption isn't officially bankrupt yet. You sit down, open the ledgers, and the math immediately makes 0 sense. The official average wages are among the lowest in the European Union. Yet, when you walk out of your hotel, the cafes are packed, the shopping malls are bustling, and there is an inexplicable number of luxury German SUVs navigating the pothole-ridden streets. How is a country this statistically poor financing this level of consumption? The answer lies in 2 parallel financial ecosystems that keep the country on life support: the remittance trap and the shadow economy. Let's start with the first one. Bulgaria's most reliable high-yield export isn't agriculture, it isn't software, and it isn't machinery. It's Bulgarians, remember those two. Million people we talked about who fled the country. They didn't just forget about the families they left behind. They went to Germany, the UK, Spain, and the US, earned Western salaries, and started wiring cash back home. In 2024, official remittances flowing into Bulgaria were estimated at nearly $2.67 billion, accounting for roughly 2.4% of the official GDP. But economists widely agree the real number is massively higher, as bags of cash are routinely driven across borders during the summer holidays to bypass banking fees. Now, at first glance, this looks like a lifeline. It's what keeps grandma's heating on in the winter. But if we look at the mechanics of development economics, heavy reliance on remittances is a massive trap. It creates a localized version of what economists call Dutch disease. Except instead of discovering a massive oil reserve, Bulgaria discovered the Munich job market. Here is how the trap works. When billions of euros flood into a developing economy from the outside, it doesn't usually go into building factories, expanding manufacturing, or funding local startups. It goes straight into consumption, buying groceries, renovating apartments, and buying imported goods. This massive influx of cash artificially inflates local prices, particularly real estate, pricing actual local wage earners out of the market. Worse, it removes the pressure on the government to actually fix the domestic economy. Why go through the painful process of reforming the local job market when the diaspora is subsidizing the poverty line for you? And this brings us to the second, even darker pillar of Bulgarian finance, the shadow economy. If you want to understand the true reality of Bulgaria, you have to realize that over a third of its economy doesn't officially exist. According to a highly authoritative 2024/2025 study conducted by the US consultancy firm Kearney and the Johannes Kepler University, Bulgaria has the largest informal economy in the entire European Union. A staggering 34.6% of the country's GDP operates entirely in the shadows. We're talking about roughly 64 billion leva, around 35 billion USD, moving completely off the books. How does an economy this large hide in plain sight? Through a very specific culturally ingrained mechanic known locally as envelope wages. Imagine you finally land a job at a mid-sized construction firm or a restaurant in Plovdiv. You sit down to sign your contract, and your new boss leans over the desk and makes you a very standard Bulgarian offer. He says, "Look, officially, I am going to register you at the national minimum wage. That is what will go through the bank, and that is what we will pay taxes on. But at the end of every month, I will hand you a physical envelope with the rest of your actual market rate salary in untraceable cash." If you are a pragmatic, hard-working citizen, you might think, honestly, good for them. If the government is just a corrupt cartel of oligarchs stealing EU funds to build fake highways, then tax evasion isn't a crime. It's a moral duty. The working class gets to keep more of their hard-earned cash instead of feeding the beast. It sounds like a great anti-establishment Robin Hood narrative. But here is where the data comes in and brutally dismantles that romantic idea. Operating in the shadows comes with a catastrophic systemic cost. First, let's look at it from your perspective as the employee. Because your official income is only the minimum wage, you cannot qualify for a legitimate bank mortgage to buy a home. If you get injured on the job, your sick leave payout is practically nothing. And the darkest irony of all, when you eventually reach the age of 65, Your state pension will be mathematically calculated based on that fake minimum wage contract you signed decades ago. You're practically guaranteeing your own elderly poverty. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of global economies, do me a favour and hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with envelope wages or shadow economies in your own country. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's look at the macroeconomic mechanics. When 34.6% of your economy doesn't pay taxes, the state is starved of billions in revenue. This doesn't hurt the oligarchs. They have private doctors and private security. It hurts the public infrastructure. This is exactly why the local hospital in the provincial town we talked about earlier looks like a dilapidated set from a 1980s Soviet movie. It's why the schools are underfunded, and it's why the state cannot afford to pay its doctors and nurses a competitive European wage. And what happens when young doctors and nurses are paid terrible underfunded state salaries? They pack their bags and move to Germany. Do you see the feedback loop? The shadow economy starves the state of resources. The lack of resources causes the infrastructure and public services to collapse. The collapsing services force the brightest youth to emigrate. The youth who emigrate send remittances back home. The remittances allow the remaining population to survive without demanding systemic political change, keeping the corrupt oligarchs in power, who then perpetuate the shadow economy. It is a perfectly closed loop of economic stagnation. It is a machine precisely designed to hollow out a nation while keeping the corpse looking just warm enough to fool the accountants in Brussels. But there is one final piece to this puzzle. If the youth are leaving and the domestic economy is operating in the shadows, what exactly is keeping the political system from facing a massive fiery revolution? To understand that, we have to look at how you divide a population against itself. We have to talk about media control, propaganda, and the Russian geopolitical shadow. 4. The information war, Russia's Trojan horse in Europe. Imagine you're a 60-year-old retired mechanic living in the provincial town of Pleven. Your pension is heavily strained, barely covering your winter heating bills and basic groceries. You open up Facebook on your phone, and a post shared by your neighbour pops up. The headline screams, Brussels mandate, new euro adoption will erase 40% of Bulgarian pensions overnight. It looks like a perfectly legitimate news site. It has a professional logo, an author byline, and quotes from a so-called financial expert. You share it to your Viber group, your friends share it. Within 48 hours, that article has been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Here is the dark, modern reality. That article was likely I translated from a Russian Telegram channel, injected into a network of proxy websites, and algorithmically boosted by bot farms operating thousands of miles away. Welcome to the digital frontline of the new Cold War. If we want to understand why Bulgaria is geopolitically paralysed, having churned through a staggering 8 snap elections in just 4 years leading into 2025, we have to look at how a nation's collective mind is captured. We have to examine the exact mechanics of modern disinformation. If you know your geopolitical history, you might be thinking, hold on, Bulgarians aren't just being blindly brainwashed by computer algorithms. They have a deep, centuries-old cultural affinity with Russia. The Russian Empire literally liberated Bulgaria from 500 years of Ottoman rule in 1878. There are massive monuments to the Russian Tsar all over Sofia. It's a genuine, organic relationship. That is 100% historically accurate. And that is exactly what makes the psychological operation so lethally effective. Professional disinformation doesn't work by inventing a brand new lie out of thin air. It works by taking a pre-existing truth, a legitimate cultural emotion, or a historical grievance, and weaponizing it. To understand the mechanics of how this functions on a national scale, we first need to look at the health of Bulgaria's domestic media. In 2025, the Reporters Without Borders, RSF, World Press Freedom Index ranked Bulgaria 71st out of 180 countries, a brutal 11-place drop from the previous year. It routinely sits near the very bottom of the European Union barrel. Why? Because the oligarchs we talked about in Chapter 2 don't just own the construction companies and the logistics firms. They own the newspapers, the television stations, and the digital portals. If you want to launder money, you buy a bank. If you want to launder reality, you buy a media conglomerate. The domestic media is so heavily captured by corporate and political interests that public trust in official journalism has virtually collapsed. And when political nature creates a vacuum of trust, a foreign predator usually steps in to fill it. Enter the Kremlin's digital apparatus. According to a massive 2025 report by the Disinformation Observatory, networks like the Pravda ecosystem, a sprawling, automated web of over 190 proxy websites, have specifically targeted Eastern Europe, and Bulgaria is arguably their most successful laboratory. Here is the exact mechanic of how they launder a narrative: the seed. A piece of anti-Western propaganda is seeded on a closed Russian-language Telegram channel. The wash. It gets scraped by automated software, translated into Bulgarian, and published on a fringe pseudo-news website that looks local but is hosted offshore. The amplification. Bot networks blast the link into hundreds of local Bulgarian Facebook groups and Viber chats, specifically targeting older demographics and rural areas where media literacy is statistically lower. The legitimation. Local populist politicians, such as members of the far-right Revival Party, pick up the viral talking point and repeat it on national television, granting it total mainstream legitimacy. By the time independent fact-checkers debunk the claim, the lie has already travelled halfway around the country, had a cup of coffee, and convinced a significant chunk of the electorate to vote against their own economic interests. Real quick. Have you noticed this kind of digital narrative laundering happening in your own country's recent elections? Let me know in the comments below. It's a global playbook now, and I read every single comment. The genius of this strategy is that it dynamically adapts. A few years ago, the propaganda in Bulgaria was heavily focused on justifying military actions in Eastern Europe, but the data indicates a massive calculated pivot. As Bulgaria moved closer to adopting the euro currency, slated for 2026, the disinformation network shifted. Their fire. Instead of talking about geopolitics, the network suddenly started pumping out hyper-targeted economic doom narratives. The architects of this campaign realized a fundamental truth. You don't need to convince Bulgarians to love a foreign power. You just need to convince them to deeply, paralyzingly fear the West. The campaigns exploit the very real economic anxieties created by the shadow economy, which we discussed in Chapter 3, and conveniently blame them on Brussels elites and Western colonizers. This is an upgraded, AI-enhanced version of an old Soviet military doctrine called reflexive control. The goal of reflexive control isn't to violently force your enemy to do what you want. The goal is to feed them highly tailored, toxic information so that they voluntarily make decisions that destroy their own systems, all while thinking it was their own idea. When you combine a deeply corrupt domestic oligarchy, a collapsing demographic base, and a citizenry that is being fire-hosed with algorithmically optimized paranoia, you don't get a functioning, forward-looking democracy. You get strategic paralysis. The electorate becomes so cynical, so exhausted, and so convinced that everyone is lying to them that they simply stop participating. Voter turnout collapses. And when the legitimate, moderate citizens stop voting, the highly organized, radicalized factions take control of the parliament. This dynamic is exactly why geopolitical analysts frequently refer to Bulgaria as a potential Trojan horse inside the European Union. A country with veto power and a seat at the table in Brussels, but with a political system highly susceptible to pulling the fire alarm on behalf of foreign interests. But as bad as the demographics, the corruption and the disinformation are, there is one final, brutal metric that dictates the physical survival of a nation. It is the infrastructure of life and death. Because if you get sick in a dying country, the true reality of the collapse hits you right in the face. Next, we're going to look at the terrifying state of the Bulgarian healthcare system, and why simply growing old here is a high-stakes gamble. 5. The healthcare roulette, where you pay to survive. Imagine you're reading a declassified national security briefing. You expect to see warnings about terrorism, foreign espionage, or cyber attacks. Instead, the Bulgarian State Agency for National Security, SANS, recently issued a report flagging a completely different existential threat: the country's own hospitals. When your own intelligence agency categorizes your healthcare system as a national security threat, you know things have officially gone off the rails. As any engineer will tell you, a system with a single point of failure is dangerous but manageable. But a system where the financing, the physical infrastructure, and the human capital are all failing simultaneously? That's not a system. That's a controlled demolition. Let's look at the brutal, verifiable math. As of the latest data stretching into 2025 and 2026, Bulgaria has the absolute lowest life expectancy in the European Union, hovering around 75.9 years, nearly 6 full years below the EU average. But it gets darker. Bulgaria currently holds the undisputed grim title for the highest rate of preventable and treatable mortality in the bloc. If the Grim Reaper had a European corporate headquarters, the data suggests it would be located in a Bulgarian provincial hospital. Cardiovascular diseases alone account for a staggering 60% of all deaths here, nearly double the EU average. You might say, look, universal healthcare is tough everywhere. The UK's NHS has massive wait times, and Canada is struggling with doctor shortages. Bulgaria just has an older population, so naturally the mortality rate is higher. It's a logical defence, but it completely ignores the underlying mechanical failure of how Bulgarian healthcare is actually funded and operated. Let's look under the hood. On paper, Bulgaria has a compulsory state-run health insurance system. It sounds great, universal coverage. But remember the shadow economy we discussed in Chapter 3? Because over a third of the economy operates in untaxed cash, the National Health Fund is chronically starved of revenue. Bulgaria allocates the lowest share of its GDP to healthcare in the entire EU. So, how does the system compensate for being broke? It shifts the cost directly onto the dying patient. Bulgaria has the highest out-of-pocket healthcare spending in the EU, standing at roughly 35%. Imagine you're a pensioner in Pleven, surviving on a few €100 a month. You suffer a heart condition. The public hospital will admit you for free, but to actually get the specific stents, the imported medication, or, let's be brutally honest, to ensure the surgeon pays special attention to your chart, you're going to pay out of pocket. Informal payments, or outright bribes to bypass multi-month waiting lists, are a normalised structural pillar of the system. It is a VIP subscription model for basic survival, but even if you have a suitcase full of cash, you run into the second, more fatal mechanic of the collapse. There is almost no one left to treat you. The human capital flight is staggering. Currently, the average age of a Bulgarian doctor is 51 years old. By 2040, an estimated 75% of all general practitioners are expected to retire. But the real crisis isn't just the doctors, it's the nurses. In a functional medical system, the golden ratio is roughly 2 or 3 nurses for every doctor. In Bulgaria, that ratio has plummeted to nearly 1-to-1. The country is currently short an estimated 17,000 nurses, meaning the system is missing a catastrophic 60% of its required nursing workforce. Why? Because a newly graduated nurse in Bulgaria is offered a base salary that often barely clears the minimum wage. Meanwhile, a recruiter from Germany or Austria will offer them 5 times the salary, a signing bonus, and a functional hospital that doesn't look like a set piece from Chernobyl. It is basic economic gravity. You cannot expect highly trained medical professionals to take a vow of poverty to subsidise a corrupt state. Quick check-in. If you appreciate us digging into the hard data instead of just repeating mainstream headlines, hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the YouTube algorithm that real data-driven analysis still matters. And the government's attempts to fix. This are practically a masterclass in dark comedy. Recently, millions in EU recovery and resilience funds were allocated to open rural medical practices to serve the 8 million citizens who currently have no access to a local GP. The catch? Because there are no doctors left in the villages, the government planned to staff them with nurses and paramedics. But under Bulgarian law, nurses cannot legally prescribe medication or operate advanced diagnostic equipment like ECG machines on their own. So the state essentially used EU funds to buy highly advanced medical gear, only to lock it inside clinics where the remaining staff legally aren't allowed to turn it on. You literally cannot make this up. When you combine astronomical out-of-pocket costs, rural medical deserts, and an evaporated workforce, getting sick in Bulgaria isn't just a health crisis, it's a financial death sentence. The hospitals don't heal the demographic collapse, they actively accelerate it. But a country isn't just its hospitals and its economy, it is also its physical environment, and if you think the healthcare system is toxic, wait until you look at the infrastructure that connects it all. Next, we're going to look at the crumbling physical reality of the state, and why living in certain regions feels like going back in time. 6. The infrastructure illusion, ghost towns and phantom highways. Imagine you're taking a road trip. You rent a car in Sofia, turn on your GPS and drive 2 hours north into the Balkan Mountains, aiming for the rural northwest. historically the poorest region in the entire European Union. As you leave the city limits, the landscape undergoes a violent shift. You drive into a settlement where the houses are still standing, but the roofs are caved in. Vines are crawling through the shattered windows of the local school. The post office is a crumbling husk of Soviet-era concrete. You pull over, expecting to see at least a farmer or a stray dog. But there is absolute, deafening silence. The population of this village isn't declining, it is mathematically zero. Welcome to a Bulgarian ghost village. As of 2025, there are literally hundreds of these settlements scattered across the country. Entire towns that have been legally erased from the map because the last remaining resident finally died and no one ever moved in to replace them. Nature is simply reclaiming the real estate. But the true danger of Bulgaria's infrastructure isn't in the abandoned villages where no one lives. The true danger is on the roads where people are actually trying to drive. If you visit the capital, Sofia, you might think I am completely exaggerating. You'd say, "Are you kidding? I just rode the Sofia metro and it's spectacular. It's clean, cheap, and expanded all the way to the airport. Plus, they are building the Struma highway down to Greece. The infrastructure is modernising." You're right about Sofia. The capital has been aggressively modernised. But Sofia is what economists call a macroeconomic black hole. It sucks in all the youth, all the EU funding and all the foreign investment, creating a shiny, Potemkin village illusion of a booming European state. It allows politicians to cut ribbons on glossy subway stations for the cameras, but once you drive outside, the localised bubble, the math turns lethal. According to the European Commission's finalised data spanning into 2024 and 2025, Bulgaria routinely fights a grim battle with Romania for the absolute highest road fatality rate in the European Union. We're talking about 82 deaths per million inhabitants, nearly double the EU average. Why are the roads so deadly? It's not because Bulgarians are genetically predisposed to bad driving, it's because the roads themselves are mechanically designed to fail, courtesy of the corruption engine we discussed in Section 2. If you want to understand exactly how a state's infrastructure is financially cannibalized, we have to look at the mother of all Bulgarian infrastructure scandals, the Hemus Highway. The Hemus Highway is supposed to be the main economic artery connecting Sofia in the west to the major Black Sea port of Varna in the east. It was started in the 1970s. Half a century later, in 2026, it is still a fragmented, unfinished joke. Here is the exact mechanic of how you steal a highway in broad daylight. Under EU law, massive public works projects require open, transparent, competitive bidding. But the Bulgarian government found a brilliant loophole called in-house procurement. Instead of holding a public auction, the government's road infrastructure agency essentially said, "Hey, we have a state-owned company called Avtomagistrali. Let's just give them the 4 billion leva, around $2.2 billion US, directly, no questions asked." But Avtomagistrali is effectively a phantom company. It doesn't own enough excavators, asphalt plants, or engineers to build a driveway, let alone a national highway network. So, what did this state-owned shell company do? It immediately turned around and illegally subcontracted the work to private, politically connected oligarch firms, handing them up to 99% of the funds entirely in advance. And here is where the story shifts from a financial crime to a dark mafia comedy. According to a bombshell indictment that was shelved for years but finally dragged into the public light by the Anti-Corruption Fund in late 2025, the money didn't go to buying asphalt. Investigators tracked over 54 million BGN, about 30 million USD of this highway funding being funneled through shell companies to a bank in Sofia. Over the course of a year, a small group of guys literally walked into the bank branch on a near-daily basis, stuffed millions of leva in cash into physical sacks, and drove it to a warehouse near the Greek border. They withdrew a highway and cash, put it in a duffel bag, and disappeared. Meanwhile, the actual construction sites of the Hemus Highway sat abandoned. When local journalists flew drones over Lot 7 and Lot 8 of the highway, sections that had been fully paid for in advance by the taxpayer, they didn't find a construction site. They found an empty forest. When the money intended for structural integrity, high-friction asphalt and reflective road barriers is sitting in a duffel bag in a warehouse, the physical reality of the road degrades. Contractors who actually do build sections of the road have to recoup the massive bribes they paid to get the contract. The mechanical result? They lay the asphalt 3 centimetres thinner than the legal requirement. They skip the sub-base drainage. They buy cheap, low-grade reflective paint that vanishes the second it starts raining. So, you're driving your rental car on a pitch-black rainy night in the Bulgarian provinces. You hit a patch of perfectly legal, government-approved new asphalt that actually has the friction coefficient of a wet kitchen floor. You skid, and because the guardrails were built using substandard, uncertified steel to save a few euros, your car goes straight through them. This is why the mortality rate is so astronomically high. Corruption isn't just an abstract number on an accountant's spreadsheet in Brussels. In Bulgaria, corruption is the physical force that pulls you through the windshield. It is a kinetic weapon. And the ultimate tragedy? Because the infrastructure outside the capital is either deadly or non-existent, foreign investors flat out refuse to build factories in the north. They look at the logistics costs, look at the phantom highways, and take their money to neighbouring Romania or Serbia instead. This locks the rural population into permanent poverty, which, as we know, accelerates the demographic death spiral. But what happens when you raise a generation in a system where the roads are rigged, the hospitals are starving, and the elections feel like a theatre production? You don't just break the economy, you break the psychology of the people. Next, we have to talk about the psychological toll of living in a collapsing state, and the rise of a phenomenon sociologists call learned helplessness. 7. The psychology of collapse, learned helplessness. Imagine you're a 28-year-old law graduate in Sofia. You've watched the previous generation tolerate the envelope wages, the crumbling hospitals, and the phantom highways. You decide you're not going to be another statistic fleeing to Germany. You're going to stay and fight. You join a reformist political party. You march in the streets. You stand in the freezing rain holding anti-corruption signs. And you mobilize your friends to vote. You do everything exactly right. You pull the democratic lever. And then the machine spits out the exact same oligarchic coalition that has run the country for the last decade. So you try again, and again, and again. What happens to a human brain when repeated immense effort yields absolutely zero systemic change? To understand the true reality of Bulgaria's political paralysis, we have to look away from economics for a moment and look at neuroscience. We need to talk about the exact mechanics of learned helplessness. In the late 1960s, a psychologist named Martin Seligman ran a now famous and highly unethical by today's standards experiment. He put dogs in a cage where the floor delivered a mild, unpredictable electric shock. At first, the dogs tried to escape, but eventually they realized the shocks were completely random and unavoidable. No matter where they jumped, no matter what they did, they got shocked. The terrifying part of the experiment wasn't the shock itself, it was what happened next. Seligman opened the door to the cage. The dogs could literally just walk out to safety. But they didn't. They just lay down on the floor and took the shocks. Their brains had fundamentally rewired to believe that their actions had zero impact on their reality. They had learned to be helpless. When you look at the Bulgarian electorate, you're looking at a masterclass in political learned helplessness on a macroeconomic scale. Now let's bring in the steel man argument. If you closely follow European politics, you might immediately object. Wait a minute. Bulgarians aren't just lying down and taking it. In the summer of 2020, hundreds of thousands of Bulgarians staged massive, sustained anti-corruption protests for months. They literally threw eggs and tomatoes at the parliament building demanding the resignation of the mafia-linked government. That is the exact opposite of apathy. You are absolutely right. The 2020 protests were historic. It was a beautiful, democratic immune response. But here is the brutal data that dismantles the romantic idea of a successful revolution. The oligarchic establishment didn't fight back with tanks, riot police, or mass arrests. They are far too smart for that. They fought back with attrition. Instead of violently suppressing the democracy, the ruling class simply weaponized gridlock. Since those massive protests, Bulgaria has been forced through a staggering, mind-numbing 8 parliamentary elections in the span of roughly 4 years leading up to 2025/2026. Here is the mechanical reality of how you exhaust a revolution. You let the reformers win a few seats, but because the parliament is fractured, no one can form a stable government. The reformists try to pass anti-corruption laws, but the old guard uses procedural delays, constitutional courts, and shifting alliances to block everything. The government collapses after a few months, A caretaker cabinet takes over. Another election is called. Rinse and repeat 8 times. It is an oligarchic subscription model where you legally cannot hit the cancel button. The political class realized a brilliant dark truth. To stay in power in the 21st century, you don't need to win the hearts and minds of the people. You just need to bore and exhaust them to death. And the data shows this strategy worked flawlessly. Look at the voter turnout. Back in the early 2000s, turnout hovered around 50% to 55%. But by the snap elections of 2024 and 2025, that number plummeted into the abyss, consistently hovering between 33% and 38%. Think about the math on that. Nearly 2/3 of the eligible voting population simply stopped showing up. They looked at the open cage door, looked at the ballot box and decided it was just another shock waiting to happen. According to recent Eurobarometer polling data, Bulgaria consistently ranks at or near the absolute bottom of the European Union for public trust in its own national institutions. Trust in the National Assembly frequently polls in the low teens. Trust in the judiciary, the exact people supposed to be putting the corrupt politicians in jail, is virtually non-existent. Quick check. Have you noticed this kind of protest fatigue or political exhaustion happening in your own country's recent elections? Let me know in the comments below. It's a psychological phenomenon we are seeing globally, and I'd love to hear your local perspective. This apathy is mathematically lethal to a state. When the moderate, reform-minded citizens give up and stay home, who is left voting? 2 groups. 1. The captive electorate. People whose jobs in the bloated, inefficient state administration directly depend on the ruling oligarchic parties staying in power. They are voting for their own paychecks. 2. The radicals. The highly motivated, hyper-angry fringes who consume the foreign disinformation we talked about in Chapter 4, voting for extreme populist parties that promise to blow up the entire system. The moderate middle is completely hollowed out. The 28-year-old law graduate we talked about at the beginning, after the 6th failed election, they finally crack. They realise they are fighting a ghost. They can't arrest a shadow economy, they can't outvote a purchased electorate, and they can't heal a dying demographic base. So, they pack their bags and move to Vienna. This psychological collapse is the final seal on the demographic death spiral. Emigration is no longer just an economic decision to seek higher wages. It becomes a psychological escape from a reality that refuses to change. But this raises a massive, glaring economic question. If the youth are leaving, the remaining population is aging, the shadow economy is hiding 1/3 of the tax revenue, and the politicians are paralysed by gridlock, how is the country not completely bankrupt? How are the streetlights still turning on? To understand that, we have to look at the ultimate geopolitical sugar daddy. We need to dissect the paradox of European Union funding and how Brussels is accidentally financing the very mafia it is trying to destroy. 8. The paradox of European money funding the mafia. Imagine you're a hard-working taxpayer sitting in an office in Munich, Paris or Amsterdam. Every month, a chunk of your paycheck goes to the European Union budget. You feel good about this. You're told this money is going toward cohesion, a noble geopolitical effort to lift the poorer Eastern European nations out of post-Soviet poverty and integrate them into the modern democratic world. If only you knew what your money was actually buying. To understand why Bulgaria's internal mechanics have utterly failed to evolve, we have to look at the ultimate economic paradox. How billions of euros in foreign aid accidentally became the lifeblood of an oligarchic cartel. If you walk through the centre of Sofia today, you will see blue plaques with the yellow European stars bolted to virtually every piece of new infrastructure. Look at this, a local politician will tell you. The EU funded our brand new metro system. They funded the renovation of our national museums. They subsidised our agricultural sector. European money is the only thing keeping this country out of the dark ages. That statement isn't completely false. EU money did build the metro, but that is the shiny, highly visible facade. To understand the true reality, we need to look at the macroeconomic mechanics of what happens when you inject billions of euros into a captured state with no functioning judicial immune system. It creates a phenomenon known as the resource curse. But instead of discovering oil in the desert, Bulgaria discovered the Brussels treasury. Let's look at exactly how this works on a micro level by dissecting one of the most infamous, darkly hilarious examples of European funding abuse, the guest house scandal. Back in the 2000s, the EU launched a rural development programme. The theory was beautiful. To stop the demographic bleeding of those ghost villages we talked about in Chapter 6, the EU would give local Bulgarian entrepreneurs a direct grant of roughly €200,000 to build rural bed and breakfasts. This would stimulate ecotourism, create local jobs, and revive the countryside. But remember the mechanics of state capture from Chapter 2? The oligarchs and political elites looked at this rural development fund and didn't see a tourism initiative. They saw a publicly funded real estate catalogue. According to massive investigations led by data journalists and later confirmed by the European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF, hundreds of these guest houses were never open to the public. Instead, mayors, deputy ministers, and relatives of the very officials in charge of distributing the EU funds used the €200,000 grants to build private, ultra-luxury holiday villas for themselves. They built mansions with massive swimming pools, high-end security fences, and zero paying guests. When European inspectors finally came knocking to audit the properties, the owners would literally recruit their own friends and family to temporarily pretend to be tourists for the afternoon. Your tax dollars didn't revive a struggling Bulgarian village. They bought a corrupt deputy minister a jacuzzi. But the guest house scandal was just petty cash compared to the motherlode, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, RF. Following the global pandemic and the energy crises sparked by the war in Ukraine, the European Union created a massive financial bazooka to stabilise member economies. Bulgaria was allocated a staggering €5.69 billion in grants, roughly 10% of its entire GDP. But this time, Brussels finally woke up to the grift. They changed the mechanics of the payout. Unlike the old cohesion funds, the RRF is a strictly performance-based tool. The new rule was brutal and simple. No reforms, no money. To unlock the billions, the EU demanded that Bulgaria hit specific, legally binding legislative milestones. The most critical milestone? Bulgaria had to establish a truly independent anti-corruption commission and pass laws that would finally make the untouchable Prosecutor General accountable to the law. And here, in the years leading into 2025 and 2026, the entire Bulgarian political machine ground to a terrifying, screeching halt. Put yourself in the shoes of a corrupt political broker in the National Assembly. The EU is dangling billions of euros in front of you. All you have to do is pass a law creating a functioning, independent anti-corruption agency. But you know exactly what happens if you pass that law. You're essentially being asked to construct the very prison cell that you, your cousins and your business partners will eventually occupy. You are being paid to sign your own arrest warrant. So, what does the political class do? They choose self-preservation. They stall. They argue over procedural nonsense. They trigger the endless loop of snap elections we discussed in Chapter 7, using the political chaos as a convenient excuse for why the reforms simply cannot be passed right now. And the data proves it. As of early 2026, the European Commission officially suspended massive payouts to Bulgaria, including a highly publicised freeze of over €215 million, specifically because the government flat-out failed to deliver the anti-corruption reforms. Less than a quarter of the total available RRF funding has actually landed in the country. The politicians are literally willing to let their own national economy starve rather than relinquish their monopoly on power. This is the ultimate paradox of European money. The funds that were supposed to modernise the country actually destroyed its internal motivation to evolve. In a normal functioning economy, if a government wants to build a highway or raise pensions, it has to collect taxes. To collect taxes, it has to foster a healthy, competitive business environment where citizens can thrive and generate wealth. The government is mechanically forced to care about the economy. But in Bulgaria, the EU acts as an artificial life support system. The political elite don't need to foster domestic businesses or fix the shadow economy, because Brussels will just wire them the cash for the major infrastructure projects anyway. The government is completely decoupled from the economic reality of its own citizens. The state functions as a massive money laundering terminal, extracting wealth from Western Europe, filtering it through rigged public procurement contracts, and funneling it into offshore accounts while the actual population dies out. It is a tragedy of mechanical design. You cannot cure a parasitic infection by feeding the host more blood. The parasite simply grows larger. And current trends heavily suggest that until the financial spigot from Brussels is fundamentally tied to the immediate arrests of high-level officials, the cycle will not break. But what does all of this mean for the future? Is this nation simply destined to fade into a geographic memory, or is there a mathematical path to survival? Next, we're going to look at the endgame scenarios for the fastest dying country on Earth. 9. The endgame scenarios, math versus miracles. We have reached the bottom of the rabbit hole. We've looked at the dying hospitals, the phantom highways, the oligarchic cartels, and the psychological exhaustion of a trapped electorate. By the year 2050, the United Nations and Eurostat project that Bulgaria's population is highly likely to plummet by another massive chunk, dropping down to roughly 5.4 million people. As the World Bank recently warned, if things don't change, the country's economic growth could permanently stall out at around a dismal 1.2% as the working-age population simply vanishes. So, what is the endgame? How does a modern European state actually operate when a quarter of its people are gone and the rest are retiring? When you strip away the political rhetoric, there are really only 3 macroeconomic scenarios left on the table. 2 are mirages, and 1 is a miracle. Let's look at the first strategy, the import illusion. If you talk to the oligarchs, running the large logistics and construction firms in Sofia today, they will tell you they have solved the labour crisis. Their plan? Just import people. In recent years leading into 2025 and 2026, Bulgaria drastically relaxed its visa laws to bring in thousands of foreign guest workers from places like Nepal, Uzbekistan and Vietnam to work in the factories and coastal resorts. You might say, look, that is exactly how Western Europe survived its own demographic slump. Germany brought in Turkish workers in the 60s, the UK brought in workers from the Commonwealth. If Bulgaria just imports cheap labour, the economy keeps running. But here is the brutal mechanic of why that completely fails in Eastern Europe. Bulgaria is not a destination country, it is a transit hub. Imagine you are a welder from Nepal, you secure a Bulgarian work visa and you fly to Sofia. You are offered a low Eastern European wage. You work for 6 months. But then you realise that your Bulgarian visa grants you access to the European continent. Why on earth would you stay in a country with a crumbling healthcare system and envelope wages when you can legally, or semi-legally, take a train to Munich and triple your salary doing the exact same job? You wouldn't. And they don't. The data shows that foreign workers routinely use Bulgarian work visas as a backdoor entry ticket to the wealthier Western European markets. You cannot import a permanent underclass to build your roads when those roads lead directly to a richer country. Which brings us to the second scenario, the automation Hail Mary. If you cannot find humans to do the work and you cannot import them, your only mathematical option is to replace the need for human labour entirely. We are entering the age of sovereign AI and hyper-automation. A shrinking workforce is theoretically the perfect catalyst for an economy to aggressively adopt high-tech, agentic workflows and advanced robotics. If you have half as many workers, but you give them AI tools that make them 4 times as productive, the GDP still goes up, and the demographic collapse is effectively cancelled out by technological leverage. It is a beautiful sci-fi economic theory. But here is the friction. AI infrastructure, modern data centres, and advanced robotics require massive capital investment. And as we discussed in Chapter 6, foreign capital does not flow into countries where the justice system is captured and the highways are made of cheap, frictionless asphalt. To become a high-tech automated powerhouse, you need the rule of law. If the ruling cartel views a multi-billion-dollar sovereign AI initiative as just another public procurement contract to steal from, the technological revolution dies on the vine. Which leaves us with the third, and only mathematically viable scenario, the institutional reset, the Irish miracle. Currently, the data paints a grim picture, but the future is not absolutely written in stone. Countries have pulled out of demographic death spirals before. Look at Ireland in the 1980s. It was the poorest country in Western Europe. Its youth were fleeing to the US and the UK in droves. It was a demographic desert. But Ireland didn't fix its population problem by begging people to have more kids or importing foreign labourers. They fixed the mechanics of their economy. They aggressively reformed their legal system, created a highly competitive corporate tax structure, and invested heavily in world-class education. They became the premier English-speaking tech and pharmaceutical hub of Europe. And what happened? The brain drain didn't just stop. it violently reversed. Millions of Irish diaspora and highly skilled immigrants from around the world flooded into the country because the economic gravity shifted. Bulgaria has the potential to execute this exact same manoeuvre. It has a flat 10% corporate tax rate, a deeply ingrained cultural emphasis on IT and mathematics, and a prime geographic location bridging Europe and Asia. The physical and economic building blocks for a massive boom are literally sitting right there. But to trigger the Irish miracle, you have to amputate the parasite. The institutional reset requires the complete systemic dismantling of the state capture model. It requires the Prosecutor General to actually put corrupt politicians in prison, which unlocks the billions in frozen EU recovery funds, which then build the actual infrastructure, which attracts the foreign capital, which creates the high-paying jobs, which ultimately convinces the 25-year-old engineer in Munich that it is finally safe to come home to Sofia and start a family. It is a domino effect, but right now the first domino is glued to the table. 10. The final takeaway. Bulgaria is not just a tragic story about a small country in the Balkans. It is a live, high-stakes laboratory. It is the canary in the coal mine for the entire developed world. It proves a fundamental economic law. Demographic collapse is rarely just about people deciding not to have children. It is the ultimate lagging indicator of a broken social contract. When a society's institutions are rigged to extract wealth rather than create it, when the future is heavily taxed to pay for the past, and when truth is drowned out by algorithmically amplified paranoia, the population doesn't need to mount a violent revolution. They just quietly disappear. They vote with their feet, and the state slowly bleeds out, perfectly legally in the dark. If you made it this far, you are the exact type of viewer this channel is built for. We don't do surface-level hype. We look at the mechanics, the data, and the ugly realities of how the world actually works. If you found value in this breakdown, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps push this kind of deep dive research into the algorithm. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next analysis. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What country's economic reality should we dissect next? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.